Buddy, to the Taubman Center and the Watson Institute. We are thrilled today to have Jeff Nussbaum, who's the author of his second book, right?
Yeah, I ghost wrote a couple.
Okay.
So this is the first one where my
With
name,
his name on it.
it is in 6-point font on someone else's book. Yeah.
Called Undelivered, the never heard speeches that would have rewritten history. It's a great read. It's wonderfully written, as you might imagine, from someone who's become a professional speechwriter. It's a personal honor and thrill to have Jeff here because Jeff was a student of mine in the first decade that I spent teaching at Brown and in my Congress and Public Policy class. So in the mid 1990s. So I'm always thrilled to welcome Brown students back, and he's had a really fascinating career. So today we're going to start a conversation about his journey after Brown, and it's a fairly impressive and interesting journey. And then we'll go right into the book, and then we'll probably conclude with his journey. So everybody should feel free to ask questions, particularly those of you who are students at Brown. You know, what choices he made, what choices what did he not do, what did he do, when did opportunities come. So we want this to be, and then your general observations about in your political lifetime, how things have changed so much. Yeah. So we'll end with that.
Great.
Okay, so the first question is, can you summarize, excuse me, your journey
Sure.
from graduation to today?
Sure. Well, my journey post-graduation actually started a little pre-graduation. After my sophomore year here, I applied to the White House internship. And I decided that that perhaps like my grades weren't going to distinguish me. And so my application essay, I have a sister who's 4 years younger than me. And when we were very young, I was 5, she was 1. We were brought into the White House. We got a chance to meet President Carter at the time. My 1-year-old sister, who would later go on to fame or infamy on the MTV show The Real World, but as a 1-year-old, we met the president. He put her down on the rug in the Oval Office. She wet the rug in the Oval Office. So my whole application essay was, very few people are lucky enough to get a chance to make a mark in the White House. I just want a chance to improve the one my sister already made. And so they kind of saw the essay and was like, throw him in with the knuckleheads in speechwriting. Uh-huh. And so summer of sophomore year, I'm writing speeches for Vice President Gore. I'm in the speechwriting office. And during that time, the chief speechwriter quit. So weird serendipity, maybe a warning about the profession. But either way, I was really thrown in writing for the vice president. And so actually, before I graduated, they asked me to come back down. And so my last semester at Brown was spent in D.C., basically doing like a correspondence course with Professor Chait, hoping that he would pass me so I could graduate Brown, but I was in Washington working. And so I stayed with Vice President Gore. And when Gore lost, or won, depending on how you count, but lost, I made a choice again. One of the stranger offers I got was to be the communications director for the New England Patriots. I decided to not take the Patriots job. They went on to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years.
The first 3 Super Bowls that they've won.
Yeah, the first 3, yeah. So the person who took the job would brandish the 3 Super Bowl rings in my face whenever she saw me. But I stayed and worked for Tom Daschle in the United States Senate.
So what I like to do is give people context as a teacher.
Yes, please.
Right? So Tom Daschle was a senator from South Dakota.
Yes, exactly.
Right, who was a House member, and then he got elected, as you remember, in 1986 to the United States Senate.
I know.
And what was his position when he went to work?
So he was then the Democratic leader in the United States Senate, and it was a 50-50 Senate. Right when I went over there, the Senate was evenly divided, 50-50. And one of the things that was happening behind the scenes is we were jockeying to see if there were any Republicans that would be open to switching. And one of the great untold stories is how close John McCain was to switching. But then the person who jumped first was Jim Jeffords of Vermont. And so during my time there, we went from being the Democratic leader to the majority leader. And then in that period of time, it was really amazingly eventful. This was the September 11th attacks took place. Our office was hit with a bioterror attack with anthrax, and then into the Iraq War. And so one of the things, and this gets a little to the book, is, 530 votes in Florida. Gore's not president. and then we watch history unfold in a dramatically different direction. And so that was one of the inciting ideas behind this book, is that these small pivots of history can lead to major, major societal changes. Anyway, I stayed with Tom Daschle until he then lost in 2004. So I don't know if it's causation or correlation, but this is one of the tough things about life in politics, is you hitch your cart to someone and there's no guarantee that they keep rolling. And I joined with a couple former Clinton colleagues and helped build a firm, a private sector firm, that did speeches and communication stuff, but I always kept a foot in politics. So in and out of politics, I helped oversee Democratic conventions starting in 2000, and every 4 years thereafter, I'd oversee speech writing for the conventions, which is a fascinating exercise in getting yelled at by anywhere from 150 to 240 speakers because you've cut their time or you want to edit their remarks. And then in 2008, I was asked by then Senator Obama to travel with and write for whoever he picked to be his VP nominee. So I have, again, undelivered speeches. I have 2 undelivered speeches for the other names I was given for the potential Obama VP picks, but it ended up being Biden. I was introduced to Joe Biden. He looked at me, crossed himself, looked skyward, and said, "I've been in the Senate longer than you've been alive. What are you going to teach me?" And that was our introduction. But ultimately, I started working with him in 2008, rolled into the vice president's office again. I used to say that my career was an object lesson in how to get almost to the top in the world of political speech writing, since I seemed to be only working for vice presidents. But then later on, Joe Biden got elected president, asked me to come into the White House, and that was my most recent White House stint. So private sector White House, and then in the interim, you mentioned books. I ghostwritten or co-written a couple books, one with former Governor and Senator Bob Graham of Florida about the intelligence failures around September 11th, one with James Carville, political consultant, bald, wonderful, crazy Cajun. And so there were book projects, there were private sector stuff, but it's always been sort of in and out of politics.
Yep. So one thing that's there's a common thread, I think, for Brown graduates is that they find themselves starting even with internships, sophomore or junior year, with really opportunities to make connections in whatever field you want to pursue. And those connections, and we were talking before,
Yeah.
those connections stay with you, but also you run into other Brown grads. You were saying that, there's a couple of other people who've also been in the same path.
Absolutely. At one point, 3 of my classmates, not just Brown grads, but 3 of my classmates were Senate communications directors at the same time. So it was, and when I arrived in Washington, the Brown grads who were at the White House really took an effort to seek me out, find me, help me. So 2 things. One is I credit Professor Schiller when I arrived in the Capitol, the fact that I wasn't completely lost had a lot to do with the Congress and Public Policy class. It really actually helped. I would never say it was a trade school class, but it was the closest thing to a trade school class. I actually knew what was going on. But the combination of the academic grounding and then the network, it really made a difference in my career for sure.
And one last question, then we'll start talking about the book. The person who you worked for Gore is now doing what? You mentioned him in the book.
So Eli Addy. So I was kind of the young guy. He then went on to be the head writer or showrunner for the show The West Wing, and then the same for House, for anyone who watched House. So when he was at The West Wing, I always gave him a hard time because he would just take stuff that we had written and edit it 2 clicks, and then it would become a plot on The West Wing. Literally, for those I never really watched the show until after it had gone off the air. But there was a thing about getting plain language awards, getting government to speak in plain language. That was something Al Gore actually did. There was a lot that was ripped from our own experiences.
All right. So I'll start with now I'll get to the book. And so I wanted to first ask, so in this book, there's wide variation of undelivered or almost delivered speeches from a range of people across history. Really a very interesting choice, from Wamsuta, a Native American, to Abe Beame, who was the mayor of New York City, to Barry Jenkins, the writer and director of Moonlight, and who, some of you might recall, won the Oscar, that movie, for Best Picture, but they read the wrong name of the movie, so he never got to deliver his famous Oscar speech.
Right.
So I'm wondering, how did you go about picking the subjects for the book? You open with a fairly poignant Al Gore in
Right.
2000, your own experience. How did you go about choosing these particular subjects?
Yeah, this has been a obsession of mine, starting with Al Gore, election night 2000. At one point, I was left holding 3 speeches he did not give that night. The election was called for Gore, and then it was too close to call. Then it was called for Bush, then it was too close to call, and then Al Gore ended up not speaking on election night. So we had prepared a victory speech, a concession speech, and then, strangely enough, a win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote, which is what we thought might be one of the outcomes. And so there was a modification where it basically explained, an Electoral College win is still a win. That is not something Americans need to be taught anymore. We recognize that's how it works. But then I started looking for, where are these other instances in history, not just in politics, where outcomes were so in doubt, or our trajectory switched so quickly that it left not just an alternate universe on the floor, but like an alternate draft, a first look at what an alternate chapter in history might be. And I really just cast a very wide net and started to find them in all sorts of places. And many of these have not, some of these are known. People know that Dwight Eisenhower prepared an apology should D-Day fail. In fact, he prepared apologies for almost every engagement that he ordered troops into battle. But I found them in all sorts of random places, and so it wasn't that I set out specifically to look for things. It's that I started doing all my reading, or when I was in archives looking for other speeches, or helping other clients, or helping other elected officials, I just had my eyes open for these, and I started to find them in all sorts of interesting places. I was reading some Australian magazine about World War II, and it mentioned that there was a rumor that Emperor Hirohito had tried to apologize for World War II and resign the throne. And ultimately I found the biographer of the person who was effectively Hirohito's chief of staff, and she had indeed found this speech, but it had never been translated into English, and so I had to commission 2 translators, because Imperial Japanese is different than spoken Japanese. Anyway, so in this book, for the first time, you see Emperor Hirohito's attempt to apologize, which we, the Americans, would not let him deliver. We wanted the emperor's seal of approval on our occupation, and for the emperor to apologize, it would have meant the emperor was fallible. For the emperor to be fallible would have meant the emperor would have to resign. So all of these, I just, I would catch wind of them and then go on this adventure where I would start to track them down. And there are others where people said, well, did President Reagan have an undelivered speech about the AIDS crisis before he ultimately said something? Is there something that's relevant to the pandemic? And I started to look. I wasn't able to find all that I hoped to find. And then the publication of this book has brought some more out of the woodwork. So now that people know there's someone who's obsessed with these, they've sought me out to say, hey, did you see this one, or did you find that one?
So one of the things that I think is so compelling about the book, there's two dimensions here. One is so compelling is that the writing is really phenomenally good. It's such a pleasure to read. It's engaging. It's riveting. It's lively. It's emotional. So one thing I'll first, and you don't have to reveal the 5 sort of ingredients, because that's in the book. You have to buy the book for that, to how to write a good speech and how to deliver a good speech. But what would you say is, the single sort of guiding principle in how writing well? That's the first question. And the second question is, you bring a lot of emotion to political characters in history who lost. Mm-hmm. And it's painful sometimes to read, sort of where were you that night? Some of you are old enough to know about the Hillary Clinton defeat in 2016, but there are other points in time when You know, people didn't get what they needed, they didn't get what they wanted, and they lost, and how they dealt with that, and all of the staff that are affected by that, all the people behind the scenes, and how you handle loss. And I think, particularly in our political era, handling loss is something that not everybody's great at. As we have seen in the last couple of years, the idea even of a concession speech as a ritual in politics is starting to wane. So if you could talk a little bit about how you used, good writing, but also how you use those talents to convey the emotions of those circumstances.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I can talk a lot about my theory on good writing, but one of the things that, and thank you for saying the book is well written, one of the things I try to do when I write, even when I write for the page, I try to write for the ear. And I think this just comes from starting as, in speech writing, I really hear the words spoken when I'm writing them. And one of the things I think I say in the book, is that a speech isn't an essay, it's sheet music, and you want the audience to hear the rhythm. And one of the things, even when I was writing the book, I really tried to write it as a speech. And as a result, one of the things that's really fun about this book is the audiobook. For those of you who are into audiobooks, I read some of it. I got to cast different actors to read some of the undelivered speeches. We brought in archival audio wherever possible, so it kind of sounds like a hybrid of a podcast and an audiobook. And as I was reading the audiobook, one of the things the producer said is, it reads so well as an audiobook. And in a way, I almost wrote it as an audiobook. That ultimately speeches, but writing also, I've always said that they're not really essays. They're not really even orations where someone stands up and offers pronouncements. I write as a conversation. Even if only one person's doing the talking, I like it to sound like a conversation. I like it to feel like you're in conversation with me in the book, which is one of the things I do. Your second question was about the losses, the losers.
No, I didn't say losers.
No, right, the losses.
People who
the
lost.
People who
Yeah,
lost.
that's
People
different.
who lost. Right,
Right.
you're right. The last president would describe them as losers. We would describe them as people who lost. I have found, the one that people paid a lot of attention to is Hillary Clinton gave me her 2016 victory speech. And one of the things I found when I was writing this book is a lot of these historical chapters are in conversation with themselves, with each other, and have a lot to say about our moment today. And the story of how Hillary came to give me her 2016 victory speech is actually because I was not involved with the Hillary campaign other than to help oversee the convention, but she had called me in to help out with her Al Smith dinner speech. So as someone who's worked in New York politics, the Al Smith dinner is an annual dinner, but quadrennially, each party's nominee speaks there, and it's a humor speech. They have to get up and tell jokes. So I was helping Hillary with jokes for the Al Smith dinner speech, and at one point she said, "Am I the first woman to speak at this event?" Because she was the first woman major party nominee. And I said, no, actually that was Ella Grasso, the governor of Connecticut in 1974. And she looked at me and was like, "How do you know that?" And I said, interestingly, the 1974 dinner took place the night before New York was set to go bankrupt and declare bankruptcy. So all of the power brokers were in the room trying to negotiate to save New York, and Ella Grasso was the one giving the speech. And I'm working on this project about undelivered speeches, and she said, well, after this election, I should give you the speech I don't give. I end up not giving. And so I waited several months after the election and kind of called and said, so about that offer. But one of the things and part of the joy of writing this book was getting to learn about leaders and chapters in history that I was less familiar with, people who I really now see as heroes who deserve to be resurrected. Kevin White, mayor of Boston in the mid-'70s, John Altgeld, governor of Illinois, right around the turn of the 1900s. But one of the things I really came to see is how important concession is, how important a ritual that is in our democracy. And I have a little digression. Each of the chapter has a digression on something to do with speech writing, how a speech gets developed. And the concession ritual, you realize, is both good for democracy, which is pretty apparent at this point, but it's also good for the person who concedes. That this is the moment when they are not seen as a political person, they're simply seen as the most relatable in many ways that they will ever be. They are a striver who has fallen short. And who can't relate to that? And so until, candidly, this last election, the most popular most politicians have ever been is the moment at which they concede. Because all of a sudden they're not seen in through a political light. They're seen simply as a human who has failed to achieve something. And so I talk about why often the seeds of political renewal are planted in the ashes of concession. And strangely enough, I'm not here to offer Donald Trump advice, but you could see, him being, he may yet be quite viable, but you could see almost him being more viable today if he had conceded at the end of this last election.
You can also point to Bernie Sanders, sort of conceding his loss to Hillary Clinton in 2016 for the nomination,
Right.
how he proceeded after that. I want to get to that point. I want to combine your sort of Democratic convention and speech writing experience with some observations about why we have some people who really can soar when they have an opportunity to give a speech at a political convention and why some don't. So in particular, there's a great story about Joaquin Castro and Juan Castro, who are brothers, the Castro brothers. Julian Castro, that's right. I can't read my own handwriting. Julian Castro, some of you have gotten my grading back, know that. Julian Castro, using a term that Jeff did not like. It wasn't derogatory.
I didn't mind it. I didn't mind it.
Infrastructure of opportunity. So there was a whole kerfuffle about this. But the point of the story is it made me think about it was the 2012 Democratic Convention. That's Mario Cuomo from 1984 gives a soaring speech, those of us who are old enough to remember that makes his career, that brings him from governor of New York to the national spotlight. The same thing is really true of Barack Obama. Maybe you can give us some
sure.
insights into that. In the 2004 nominating convention, where John Kerry is nominated to be the Democratic presidential nominee, and they're so resounding that people say, "Wow, that person should run for president." And of course, Mario Cuomo never actually does, and Barack Obama obviously does. So why is it that some people, and Bill Clinton gave the keynote address
Right.
in 1988, although it was so long that people said he shouldn't run for president because he talks too long, but he got better at it. So why is it some people can take that opportunity with a single speech and other people can't? What have you learned from your time in politics and speech writing about that?
Yeah, it's a really wonderful question. And I will say I was helping oversee speech writing operations at the 2004 convention. And so I saw all the speeches come through. And I saw the Obama speech, and I saw it on paper, and I thought, yeah, red America, blue America, United States of America, like, this is okay. This will be good. This will be fine. And then he gets up there, and there was just an electricity in the room. And the way that speech writing at the conventions work is everyone has to go through and practice. Everyone has to practice in this teleprompter prep room that kind of mimics the convention setup. And so every so often, the person doing the teleprompter coaching will come running into the speech writing room and say, like, make sure you're in the hall for Jennifer Granholm. Make sure you're in the hall for Deval Patrick. It's going to be electric. It's going to be good. And Michael Sheehan, who was the guy who was doing the media training at the time, said, I think this Obama guy is going to be pretty good. And so we go into the hall, and that convention had kind of lacked a little energy, right? Like, there people had been excited about Howard Dean. They were a little less excited about John Kerry. John Edwards was okay. And then Obama gets up there. And the combination of his youth, and when you watch the videos, he looks so young, and the energy and the sort of this idea that someone can come out of nowhere. And I would argue a little bit that this is actually a problem that we face in politics, that we look for individual saviors rather than really investing in the infrastructure of what actually elevates ideas and elevates policies. But in the room, it was just magical. And so what does that have to do with? Well, I said earlier that I see speeches mostly as conversations. You don't get a ton of opportunities to speak to a crowd of 14,000 people in a room and sense what that electricity is. Those are moments where you want orations. And Obama, just the cadence, the rhythm. There are all sorts of Greek names from Aristotle for, red America, blue America, United States of America, right? I don't forget if it's an aphora or epistrophe where you repeat a same sound at the end of the sentence. But all of those buttons he hit in a way that people felt like they were at a concert. They were hearing the music. And you mentioned Julian and Joaquin Castro. Several years later, 2012 Democratic Convention, Julian Castro was a rising star as mayor of San Antonio. San Antonio is the 9th or 10th largest city in America, and he is a twin, and his twin brother had been developing this idea that we build an infrastructure of opportunity, and his speech was largely based on this idea of an infrastructure of opportunity, and David Axelrod, who was kind of the message guru for Obama, saw the draft and said, we don't even use the word infrastructure to describe infrastructure, so I'll be damned if you're going to have a keynote speech using the word infrastructure to describe opportunity. And so we had to excise this infrastructure of opportunity and find a different way of talking about it. And it so happened that we were working on the speech and the Summer Olympics were happening, and we came up with this idea that the American dream isn't a sprint. It's not a marathon. It's actually a relay, because the Castro twins talked about the fact that, they were 2 generations removed from their immigrant status and the sacrifices their mother made, and that kind of became the powerful idea that if you invest in opportunity today, you get prosperity tomorrow, but that the American dream is something that's realized over the course of generations, and so you have to help each generation move a little further. So it's the same thing, right? It's like, now find the infrastructure of opportunity. It's in there, it's just not those words.
Yeah, it's interesting because Barack Obama was a state legislator from Illinois, running for the United States Senate in Illinois in the summer of 2004. He had not yet been elected to the United States Senate.
Yeah, and here's your $2,000 trivia question. Who did everyone think was going to win that Senate race? A guy named Dan Hines, who was kind of the politically anointed person. And so Obama sort of came out of nowhere to win the Senate race.
Right, and he got a bit of luck. His Republican opponent was involved in a very nasty personal scandal late in the summer,
right.
So that helped him a little bit. And then you think about Julian Castro, and you think smart, did well in Texas, had a good bit, was really talked about. Later on became, I think, Secretary of Transportation.
Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
Housing and Urban Development. But just could not command the room the way that other people had. And so this is something to think about when you're thinking about whether it's Trump or it's Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or any other major political figure, President Biden right now, or anybody, Ron DeSantis from Florida, any figure that most people are becoming familiar with. How do they actually break through, and do they have what it takes, even in a social media fragmented environment, to break through in that moment? So it's just fascinating who resonates and who doesn't.
And one of the things I'll say from my time with Biden is I am continually awakened to how much we expect of our presidents and our political leaders. We expect them to be inspirational and electrifying. We also expect them to have total command of policy. And we expect them to be incredible fundraisers. And we expect this and we expect that. And we ask a lot of them. And it's really hard to find someone who can succeed across all of those dimensions at all times.
I have just 2 more questions, and we'll open it up to the audience, because a lot of you are here, and some of you have to leave for classes. So the first question is the first of the 2. In the choices you've made in the book for the subjects that you've covered in the book, you managed to capture momentous people and momentous eras of American history. So you go from John Lewis, to Hillary Clinton, to Barry Jenkins, but also to Abe Beame, to Richard Nixon. And did you set out to frame these choices about these speeches that are undelivered, understanding that you would also be reflecting really important moments of history, like you mentioned Kevin White, the mayor of Boston, in American history, because that's what this book does that makes it, I think, so worth reading, is capturing these really pivotal moments in time with the people that are involved in them.
Yeah, initially when I started the book, a lot of people were like, oh, so you just found a lot of these undelivered speeches and you'll just put them in a book and you'll write a couple paragraphs leading into them. And that was the initial idea, right? This thing would have been a much smaller book. But one of the things that started to happen is the more I dug in, I realized almost each chapter could be its own book, because the fascinating part, yes, some of the speeches are fascinating, and some are poignant, and some are powerful, and many of them should be seen anew and heard more clearly today, even though they weren't heard in their own moment. But for me, the really fascinating thing was re-excavating these chapters of history. And I'm not a historian and I'm not a journalist, but this book allowed me to behave as both and realize, oh, right, the mid-'70s were really rough, ugly time financially, politically. Nixon, here I have Nixon's non-resignation speech. He had prepared a speech refusing to resign. Boston's racial strife in the mid-'70s over the issue of busing. John Lewis in the 60s, what he really wanted to say at the March on Washington, which, if he had delivered the speech he really wanted to deliver, maybe we would be talking about the nightmare and not the dream. So each of these chapters in history, including one that could have been our last chapter in history, which is John F. Kennedy announcing airstrikes on Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, not knowing at the time that many of the missile sites were already complete and operational. So for me, the discovery was that the speeches became windows into these incredibly fraught moments in history where things could have gone the other way, and in many cases could have gone much worse than they actually did.
Yeah, it's really, it's fascinating. Okay, so I'll open it up. And my last question is, or maybe my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, is what do you think that you got out of your experience at Brown, both in the classroom and then just with your Brown colleagues and the Brown environment, that you've carried through your life to date? And, by all objective measures, your life has been relatively successful. You're doing something that you love, and you've been really involved in things that you love to do. What is it about the Brown experience that guided you over these past years?
Yeah, well, I'm always happy to sing Brown's praises. So I'll start with just the academic side of it. I was here early in your time here. I was here early in Professor Tomasi's time here. And those really became kind of two, not poles, but two areas on the spectrum of my education. I'm constantly informed by what I learned in the political theory classes and constantly educated by what I learned in Congress and public policy. And then there was Professor Ross Chait and a lot of the methodology and things of that nature. So the academics prepared me, certainly. And then I spent a lot of time at the Brown Daily Herald. I wrote columns for the Brown Daily Herald, and this was a time when blogs didn't really exist, Twitter certainly didn't exist, social media didn't exist, and so it was my columns on the Brown Daily Herald that became the writing samples that got me the speechwriting job and the speechwriting internship. So the Herald helped, the academics helped, the peers, as I mentioned earlier. I just happened to be part of a group of friends, many of whom were deeply politically minded, and politically minded in a way that they went into politics and decided that the way to affect change was from the inside, right? There are a lot of people who, and I get it, think that the way to affect change is from the outside. We were sort of a group of we were very progressive, but we were pragmatic in how we wanted to be involved in politics. So that was part of it. And then, of course, there's the Brown Alumni Network that helped as well. So, but cultivating a worldview of curiosity, when I went into speechwriting, there was no set path into speechwriting. Now, speechwriters have become known, right? People listen to Pod Save America and Favreau and Lovett and those guys.
When you say people,
right.
I don't listen to those.
You don't listen to those.
Many. So who is many? Who are the people that listen to them?
Well, they can.
How would you describe people?
Who has heard Pod Save America or listened to Pod Save America?
So younger.
Yeah, but a quarter of this room, right? So a quarter of this room can name a speechwriter, which is not something that I think could have happened when I was here, unless you were deep into history and you would say Ted Sorensen.
Right, that's a good point.
Judson Welliver. I mean, these are not names people know.
Or Ted Widmer.
Right, or Ted Widmer, whose father was the dean of admissions who suspended me before I got here. But anyway, totally different story. but
Not suspended from Brown. This is
right,
just a
suspended
pre-Brown
in a high school-
circumstance.
Right, yes. But there people at least know that speechwriting is something people could go into. I didn't know that, and so the real takeaway, and when I looked to hire, when I had a firm and I hired young people, wasn't someone who now followed a kind of paint by numbers way. They said, well, I took this class on political communication and I read this book. We looked to hire people who just showed curiosity about the world and brought a worldview. And we hire from people who are winning pun competitions at bars in Brooklyn. We hire musicians who come to writing with a different perspective. And I think Brown really cultivated the curiosity in addition to the skills that made it possible for me to have the career I've had.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to anybody who has any questions about the book or about experiences. I did this morning in class too. I couldn't.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are you confident that the speech that Hillary Clinton sent you was unedited in light of the events that occurred during the months after her unsuccessful campaign?
Oh, yeah.
Wait, I'm going to repeat the question just so
Okay.
everyone can hear because we don't have a mic at the moment. So the question is, is Jeff confident that the speech he received from Hillary Clinton a couple months after her defeat was unedited, was actually the speech she was intending
So
to
you're
give?
saying, like, did she doctor it after the fact so that it would hit with more impact in retrospect? And the answer is yes. And the reason is because her people gave me access to the Google Docs so I could see when it was last edited and who edited what. And so I was able to look at 8 iterations of the speech that end at about 8 or 9 p.m. on election night, right? That was the moment they realized this draft is no longer operative. Now, the speech that changed a lot was the concession speech. There was also a concession speech that night, and when it became clear that that speech was the speech that was going to have to be given, it became clear also how insufficient that speech was to the level of divisiveness of the campaign, the level of grief that half the country was feeling, and things like that. But yeah, the speech that is in the book is the last existing draft at the moment they stopped working on it.
Any other? Yes? And then I'll get you.
It's interesting to hear you say that you think there's like a path to speechwriting. Because yes, I can name a speechwriter, but it still feels like that's the job that you just sort of fall into by having your sister pee on the white horse car.
Yes.
Like,
Right.
well, I guess what is the traditional path to speechwriting these days?
Well, there
Great
isn't
question.
a traditional path because it's not even a job. It was a job that for a long time you weren't even allowed to have it on your business card in the United States Senate. Like, it didn't exist. But people have always done it. And the evolution is that a lot of the people who wrote speeches were policy advisors first and poets second, right? It was Dick Goodwin with Lyndon Johnson who kind of created the idea and a lot of the policies of the Great Society and also wrote these wonderful speeches, and Ted Sorensen with Kennedy similarly. And it was only during, I'll give my little history lesson, it was only during Richard Nixon's administration where he really modeled his Office of Communications on what were then thought to be the pinnacle of communicators, which were the Madison Avenue ad agencies. Like, right, he kind of created his own Mad Men, and he exiled them across the street from the White House. So the communications office was its own thing, and all of a sudden these people who were amazing writers, we're talking about people like William Safire and others,
Pat Buchanan,
who
ran for president.
Ray
couple
Price.
times.
I mean, these are people who take a backseat to no one in terms of their writing skill. But all of a sudden, they didn't really have a relationship with the president. They didn't have a relationship to the policy process. They were handed the policy and expected to sell it. So now, a lot of schools offer something akin to a speechwriting class. I don't think Brown does, but the graduate programs at Northwestern and American University and other places. So in a lot of places, you can take a speechwriting class, and there's a textbook, to the extent you want to know it, called The Political Speechwriter's Companion, which is a wonderful nuts and bolts how-to book that my first boss in the White House wrote and kind of remains a really good. To the extent that speechwriting is an art and a craft, the book really handles the craft very well. And so that exists now. It didn't exist then.
So maybe we can invite Jeff Nussbaum to be a professor at Brown and come back and
I-
teach that class
I
at some
would-
point.
I
We'll have
would
to be
be
thinking about that.
Honored to. Yeah.
Well, to the point on relationships, I guess I'm curious about if there's a particular method you use, or how do you go about getting to know and getting familiar with the voices of the people that you've written for in order to, assume their voice and make it better, I guess.
That's
And can I piggyback two-finger on that? How do you also attract clients? So,
Yeah.
I mean, exactly right. So how do you get to know the people that you're writing with, but how did you actually build this business?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, because one of the first questions I'm often asked when I'm with clients is, well, I'm a unique person. How are you going to make it sound like me? And the thing I don't say to them is, well, if you liked the way you sounded, you wouldn't have called me, right? So there's part of that. But the question is, how do you make it sound like me? And there are lots of ways you can make something sound like someone. When I go in to do the work, I watch YouTube videos of them. I read interviews. I look at everything they've written. I look at everything they've said. But that allows you to do kind of a pale imitation. So James Carville, who I worked for many years, he is as Cajun as they come. He's from Louisiana. He does not sound like me. I do not sound like him. And there were times when I would write for him, and I just sounded like I was imitating him. So I worked on a book with him, and he wanted to talk about how every recipe in Louisiana begins with a roux. And with his accent, I heard root. Who here is roux? Who knows what a roux is? Right? Yes, right? It's what you cook, right? It's sort of your oil, flour kind of base for a lot of cooking. So I wrote a whole half a chapter on the metaphor of beginning with a root, that things start from the ground up. And he looked at me and goes, son, what the hell are you talking about? Right? So clearly, I wasn't quite hearing him. And to get around to the answer of your question, the second part of writing for someone isn't just how you sound like them. It's how do you think like them. So I spend a lot of time interviewing the people I write for and trying to understand how they see the world, how they get from point A to point B to point C when they're making an argument. So that combination of sounds like me, thinks like me, is really how I approach the speech writing work. And you had asked how you get clients. So
Well, you built a business. I mean,
Yes,
at a
so-
relatively young age, you built a business.
Yeah.
So how did you do that?
Well, a lot of it was cultivating kind of a mystique, right? It was we didn't have a website for a long time. And the website, or maybe we did, but it didn't have a phone number. It was just look, if you need us, you know how to get us, right? And so for those of you who watch Parks and Recreation, right, they start a business and they turn away the first 300 customers and they realize they don't have any customers anymore. We were dangerously close to doing that, but really it was word of mouth, and it was having a couple of key validators, a couple of people who would be willing to say publicly. There are a lot of people who aren't willing to admit or concede publicly that they have speechwriters, and you respect that. I talk about the profession being one of, what if someone gave you an opportunity to be in the room when the most momentous decisions were being made, but the trade-off was you couldn't tell anyone you were there. And that was a lot of my job early in my career, and continues in many ways. And so having a couple of key validators who would whisper, after they gave a viral TED Talk or after they wowed the crowd at Davos, actually, I got a guy. And that's really what the business was built on initially.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to what was asked earlier about the pathway that one takes. But I'm curious, as someone with a relative interest or thinking they might be interested in speechwriting, and where do I look for opportunities in Providence or at school, in addition maybe to a White House internship,
Yeah.
where I can find people who need speeches and are looking for people to do that writing for them, and might be like, there's a student, why don't I send it and trust them, because that feels almost like a scary leap.
It is. It's a big leap. And remember, you don't need to immediately. Let me answer a slightly different way. The first answer is, you write for whoever gives you a chance to write, and that includes you, right? The op-eds were my ticket into speechwriting, because the hardest leap, and you've identified it, is to get someone to let you write for them. And And there are a lot of places where you could go where no one is going to say, hey, we need a speechwriter. But there are campaigns who are going to say, we need everything, right? We need someone to drive the candidate around. And we need someone to rally, run the volunteer effort. And then when you're having your volunteer meeting, you get to write a 2-minute speech where you talk about what you need from the volunteers. In your own life, probably not yet in your life, but like you'll have friends who are getting married and need a best man toast. God forbid a relative passes away and you need to give a eulogy. So like, it's not just who's going to hire me or who's going to let me write for them. It's a mentality that says, if I love to write, I will find every opportunity to write. Whether that's op-eds, whether it's in my own life, whether it's in these little moments, whether it's volunteering for a local elected official who will let me write correspondence for them, right? Good letters are writing samples, congratulations letters. So all of these things are writing samples, and this is what I did here. I mean, I wrote for, once I realized after that internship that I really wanted to write, I wrote for the Providence Phoenix, which was the arts rag. I don't even know if it still exists.
No, it was a free newspaper, yeah.
It doesn't exist anymore.
No.
Maybe it doesn't, no, sadly. But I mean, I wrote for the yearbook. People don't really write for the yearbook, but like I wrote for anyone who would let me write, and I wrote for myself. I wrote op-eds. And ultimately I got to a point where when people were looking to hire me, I could say, here's what I've written. And when I hire people, we hire people who send us truly eulogies for their parents, eulogies for their grandparents, just something that shows that allows their personality to come through. And so where you find opportunities to do that. But also for me in my career, I mean, one of my formative political experiences was helping a candidate for state senate in Massachusetts who was running against an incumbent. It was sort of a suicide run against an incumbent in a primary, and we won. And that was as much of a political education as anything else, how to get signs up, how to get people to agree to let you put signs in their yards and things like that. So all of it, once you're in the thick of it, if you find work that you really believe in, then there's an opportunity to write, because at one point, this candidate said, hey, we have a mailing going out from my mom, will you help write it? And so my grand idea was, and you couldn't do this post-anthrax, was let's buy a bunch of tea bags and put a tea bag in every envelope and have the letter say, hey, I want you to sit down, brew yourself a cup of tea, and I want to tell you about my son, Peter. And that became like a thing. And so, any opportunity becomes then an opportunity to show what you can do.
Yeah, I would say the same thing even when I was working on in a district internship and then a Capitol Hill internship in college. I saved all of my sample constituent letters that I had drafted for the congressperson. And when I went to get an interview for a job after college in the United States Senate, I handed them my folder of letters that I had written as an intern. And that got me the job because it was a similar job with maybe a minor step up, but it was the same job. So save everything that you think that you have. Obviously, it's much easier to save it. In those days, it was on paper copy, but save everything you do.
And by the way, I had a similar experience. I mean, I was struggling in my early days with Al Gore, and every night I would print out whatever I'd written and take it home with me in case they asked me not to come back the next day.
Yeah, no, that's true. And people, when they leave Capitol Hill, they used to print everything out that they had written. It's true, memos. I still have a whole collection of memos that I wrote in the Senate. So
right. When I left this job, I did send everything to the archives that had to go to the archives.
You did.
Yes. So,
yes. So I can't. So we're gonna break, but I can't let you go without asking you just a little bit to tell us a little bit of the reflections of working. And I think Ron Klain was in your life as a young
yeah, so
staff,
he hired
and then
me
now,
for my first job,
yeah,
and then
right.
he was White House Chief of Staff, still is White House Chief of Staff.
So it's just longevity of staff in Washington. People stay a long time, but
and a good reminder that keep up with people who mentor you, update them, and be kind to everyone. The people who ultimately help you may not be in a position to help you early on in your career, but there's never a reason to be rude or superior, step on toes. And it's one of the great, Buddy Cianci, former mayor of Providence, right, famously said, the toe you step on today may be connected to the ass you have to kiss tomorrow. So maneuver through the world with a long-term view that the friends you make now will be meaningful both as friends but potentially as professional contacts.
yeah,
But
especially in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
mantra. You never know where anybody will
Right.
be, so.
But to your question about reflections, there was one week where everyone was basically a COVID close contact, and I wasn't. And so there was like a couple days where I was in like 4 briefings with the president, kind of sitting with the corner, sitting in a corner in case something had to be written. And for me, the takeaway, we often say when we're helping candidates who have experience, oh, experience really matters. But as I was spending those couple of days, and he was preparing for a bilateral meeting with the president of Singapore and had to make a decision on solar panel importation, and there were a bunch of other things going on, realizing that was the moment when actually I started to believe what I had been saying for years, which is that experience does matter, realizing the number of issues that were being thrown at him on any given day, and all of them he had seen them before. And that's what really matters. None of them were too big for him. All of them he recognized the 3-dimensional chess that needed to be played. Oh, with the president of Singapore, shouldn't I raise with him and get a little intel about where we can push China to apply a little pressure to the Soviet Union on Ukraine? I mean, sort of seeing the dots. I was just wildly impressed by that, and it impressed upon me that actually having someone who has seen a lot of it before is incredibly valuable in moments when small decisions have really big compounding outcomes.
Well, on that very articulate reflection, we'll end the formal part of our presentation. We do have a book signing. If you want to come speak to the author, please join us. And then again, there are still refreshments outside remaining. So thank you so much for coming. We appreciate your time. And again, Jeff is available to have a conversation, to sign a book, whatever you would like.
Yeah.